Good evening and welcome to Dessert and Dish. Dessert and Dish is our weekly interview segment where we get to invite real people to dish on the real challenges and blessings of living faithful lives. We always feature a weekly dessert as well, hopefully something local or homemade because, dessert always makes conversations that much better and because we all need a little reminder of the sweetness of the kingdom of God already at work in our midst. I'm so excited to welcome a couple of clergy gal pals tonight, Dessert and Dish. Welcome to the Reverend Sheila Van Zandwyk. Sorry for stumbling over your name there. And to the Reverend Canon Kathy Morgan. It's so nice to have you both on screen tonight. I know that we had hoped that we would get to gather in person. We even talked about, wearing boas and that kind of thing. But, Zoom is going to have to make do. Thankfully, we do have some dessert, even though we can't be together in person. And we all live in the same area, so we actually all get to have the same dessert tonight. I'm pretty excited to introduce this week's dessert. We can all hold it up. All right, so hopefully you guys can see this, but this is what's called a cream-filled pastry horn. And it is from a place on Lakeshore Road called Your Bakery. And we've had some desserts from there before at Dessert and Dish. We've had their custard tarts. I actually went there yesterday with the hope of finding their bee sting cake because I thought that sounded so springy, but they didn't have their bee sting cake available. They did have these delicious looking little pastries. So, take a bite and tell me what you think.
I love eating on camera.
I know. On reality TV shows, they're not allowed to eat on camera because nobody wants to see that. But I think the people who are tuning in with us are much more forgiving, right?
And would understand that we can't just stare and look at them through the conversation. We have to be able to enjoy them.
Yeah, I mean, staring at the desserts and not enjoying them is totally the opposite of the point. So
It's wrong.
good.
It just looks like every one of our family photos.
I love.
We're always eating.
I love that. What do you think? Pretty good, eh?
Oh, very good.
Fabulous.
Very nice.
Yeah. Well, anybody who's in St. Catharines should definitely check out Your Bakery. It'll become Your Bakery too. And we've got some great homemade sourdough breads and all kinds of other fabulous things. I was saying before we began the recording tonight that my son really tried to eat all of these pastries today, but I did manage to save one for our interview. It fought him off for 24 hours. So this is our chance now that we've really introduced the dessert, now we get to introduce our guests and talk a little bit more about each of them. So Kathy, we're going to begin with you. Kathy serves at St. John's Anglican Church in Thorold. And Kathy, I'm hoping that you could just walk us through, some of the basic wheres and whens of your life in ministry. Where did you grow up? How long have you been ordained? And when did you come to this area?
Well, that's actually easy. I actually grew up in the Diocese of Huron, and so grew up in a little village just kind of northeast of London, a little place called Thorndale, farming community, and grew up on a dairy farm. And I attended actually St. George's Anglican Church in Thorndale. And the lovely story is that it was actually some of my descendants that had donated the land for it. So it's fun every time we have an anniversary, they get excited that there are still descendants of some of the original families who are still connected to the parish. I have actually, as of the end of May, it's the 25th anniversary of my ordination to the diaconate. So it's been a long time. Time flies when you're having fun.
Wow.
It will be.
It's amazing.
It will be. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And so I started all of this process and this journey as somebody from the Diocese of Huron, but then I met a nice young divinity student and got married and came to the Diocese of Niagara. It was going to be challenging enough to have two clergy family without two dioceses and two clergy. So I came to the Diocese of Niagara, was ordained here, and I have had two parish experiences before Thorold and have been here about 4 years in the Thorold, in the St. Catharines and Thorold community. So it's kind of exciting.
Nice. Well, and you and I have kind of talked about some of the overlap in our stories because I'm a Huron girl who grew up in a farming community, although not on a farm, and came to Niagara because of a boy. So
That's right.
I can relate to some parts of that story, but 25 years, oh my goodness, that is such an incredible milestone. Very, very cool. So
Have to have a bit of a party for that.
On Zoom.
Yeah,
Zoom.
you have to have a party. Are some of your like fellow compatriots around to like have a
No, actually, we folks have kind of scattered. So the folks that I was ordained with at the cathedral in Hamilton, one is retired, one has sadly passed away after a battle with cancer. Two have retired actually, and one is now doing ministry in England. And so folks have kind of really scattered. And so haven't really stayed as connected with some of the ones I graduated and were early ordained with, because everyone's journey has taken them in such different places.
Wow. Well, I'm hearing a call, Sheila, for you and me this celebration then.
Definitely.
We haven't had 25 years, but we can still help you celebrate, Kathy.
Yeah.
That's right.
And that's the 25th?
The 25th, no, it's towards the end of April. I think it was the 26th. It was the May long holiday weekend.
Oh, you
So-
just had it. Oh.
No, it's coming up at the end of May.
Oh,
But no, I remember at the ordination weekend, there was some grumbling because it was the long holiday weekend. Because it just, Pentecost fell over the Victoria Day weekend that year.
Yeah.
And everyone was excited to be going to an ordination on a Sunday afternoon. And of course, it was always a warm Sunday afternoon. So it was a hot day at the cathedral that day.
For sure, for sure. Well, I don't know. It sounds like a pretty great way to spend a long weekend if you ask me, but okay, well, that's a very cool celebration. So you are here at the Church of the Transfiguration, just up the street from where St. George's is located, really, or in the south end of town. You grew up here in St. Catharines, and then as an adult, I believe you became an involved member of Grace Anglican Church. Can you tell us about your journey that brought you to end up in the Anglican Church and then to come back to St. Catharines? What's that route look like for you?
Sure. So I was raised in the Christian Reformed church. My father emigrated from Holland. That tends to be the kind of major faith tradition in Holland is Christian Reformed. And so I attended there till I was about 18 and then went to university. I went to Brock, so I didn't move away from town, although I did move out of my parents' house shortly after that. And I think I found at that time with some searching that I just found that the Christian Reformed Church didn't feed me in certain ways. And so because of a boy, hence the theme I think should be tonight, because of a boy, I dated a guy in university who was an Anglican.
Okay.
And they were from Beamsville, actually. Went to church with them there. And then there was a priest at Grace Church that my boyfriend's mother knew quite well, and she wanted to hear him preach. And so we went to church with her. So that was my first time going to Grace Church. And just really enjoyed the liturgy a lot, enjoyed the music, enjoyed some of the tradition that was around it. And so went through a couple of years of kind of going to church, not going to church, not sure what I wanted, but then very much felt called back to church. Really missed it when I hadn't been going for a while, but really felt like it wasn't the Christian Reformed tradition I wanted to go back to. And so I thought, well, I've tried this Anglican tradition. Why don't I try this again? And so started going, and it was one of those things where I sat at the back of the church and disappeared as soon as the blessing was done, not staying for coffee here. Of course, within a couple of years, I was a warden because that's what happens in the Anglican church. No lie. And was singing in the choir and was a cantor, the whole thing. Um, so it was a couple of things. It was the liturgy, but it was also the inclusiveness of the Anglican tradition, which really spoke to me. I've always said that I was somebody live not in a black and white world, but in a very gray world. I'm quite happy in the gray world. I don't need it to be black or white. And I think I found with the Calvinist tradition, it was a little bit more black and white. And it was why I think I kind of always struggled a little bit. So the Anglican, the middle way, it's always the middle way. And I'm a middle child. Maybe that was it. So that was when I started going to Grace. And it was through Grace that while I was at Grace Church that I heard my call to ordination. It was actually heard by a woman whose home we used to meet at to have a Bible study, which I had been leading for a number of years, kept saying it. And I kept thinking, yeah, Edith, you don't know me well. I don't think this is what God's calling over here. But eventually she was correct. And I did follow that. So after ordinations, I've been ordained for 14 years. I've been coming up at the end of this month. After ordination, I was in Oakville for a couple of years at St. Simon's, and I was a curate there. And then I was rector of St. Michael's in Hamilton. And I was there for almost 9 years, or a little over 9 years. Loved my time there. It was really good. But during the last few years that I was at St. Michael's, my parents were both aging. My dad was getting into his 90s and my mother into her mid 80s, and they needed a bit more help. My two sisters both live out in BC, and my brother lives in Niagara Falls, and he had been doing a lot, but it was getting to be a bit much, and I felt that I wanted to be closer to them, but didn't feel like I would take a position just for that reason. But it was something I was kind of thinking of in the back of my mind. And then I was approached and asked if I knew that Transfiguration was looking for somebody and would I apply? And I thought I knew a bit about Transfiguration, having gone a couple times before. So I did. And so here I am back in my hometown, which I am loving very much. It's nice to be close to my family. My father passed away about a year ago. So it was really great to have that time to be here with them and with my mom afterwards. That has been just really a blessing to be in the midst of that, have my brother closer and some of my friends from high school. So I am enjoying being back in St. Catharines. Although I got to admit, I did not know about your bakery, but I am going to be trying it.
Yes, now it can be your bakery too.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, sorry, how long have you been back in St. Catharines? It's been a couple of years?
About a year and a half. So I arrived about 6 to 7 months before COVID hit. So I had only been in the parish really a short period of time when suddenly we were into lockdown and all of that. So 2/3 of my ministry so far, Transfiguration, has been online, on Zoom, on telephone, and not really in person.
Yeah, that is tricky. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how that's tricky. As I was kind of thinking about today's interview, I thought that there were a lot of directions that we could go. And I do want to touch on kind of the ups and downs of this past year plus. But, I think that I certainly hear a lot of people interested in hearing what it's like being a female priest. And I couldn't resist the opportunity with the three of us as female priests, women in ministry, to talk a little bit about that experience. Now, in some ways, it's not unusual to have three women together who are serving in ministry because, women have been serving in ordained ministry in the Anglican Church of Canada longer than I have been alive. We have.
Thank you for making me feel old, Martha.
Yeah, I know.
No, it's just it's to say that it's not new, right?
No,
it's not new. We have deacons, priests, bishops, archbishops, and national bishops who are all women. So we do see women in leadership in every part of our church, but at the same time, we are still a minority among our colleagues. And, I think every female priest has encountered some forms of resistance or certainly surprise that women can be priests. And, we've had to, even though like female leadership in the church isn't new, we have had to chart some uncharted waters in our ministries, right? So I would love to hear just some reflections from each of you. Why don't we start with like growing up in the church? Did you see women in ministry, and was it a natural thing to consider priesthood as an option on the table?
Want me to go? I can say definitively no, because the Christian Reformed Church only started, I couldn't even give you an exact date of when they started ordaining women, maybe in the last 10 years. And there still are not very many. And in fact, it was something that was brought up when I was going through the ordination process. I had come to the point where you were interviewed by people in the diocese. And one of the women who interviewed me, one of her comments was, I don't think Sheila actually pictures herself as a priest. So that was very interesting. So I did a summer play, and I had a female priest when I was at Grace Church. I had one, but it is true that in my mind, and I think one of the reasons I had never considered ordination before this was it just didn't occur to me that was a possibility as a woman, right? So yeah, I would say that definitely growing up did not have any sort of indication about that or any examples of that in my life.
Yeah. How about you, Kathy? What was your experience?
There wasn't actually a lot of that. It's funny because I look back now, and in many ways I think there were lots of examples of women in ministry, but they weren't leadership in ministry. Like they ran the Sunday school, they looked after the altar guild. It was the women who did a lot of the fundraising with a lot of the meals and the catering. And so in many ways offered leadership roles and were very key, but that's not how we saw ministry at the time. Like ministry was the ordained minister. I think I was almost 17 before I saw my first female Anglican cleric. I was just kind of speechless, like, because she was young and she was the curate from the cathedral. She was confident in her own skin. She was in her mid-20s. And I was a delegate to synod, and you would see these young women, and it was just, wow, like it was just kind of, we were a little bit more of a conservative church. When I became a server at 13, that was a big to-do because girls hadn't been servers. Girls were in the choir, the boys could be servers. And so that was a really big deal when I became a server at 13. And, that was, and so to kind of go to some of these other things and see these women who were able to do it kind of straight through. And so we're kind of on that early wave of women who were, as I said, who were kind of confident in their own skin, and they were, maybe in their early to mid-20s. Like it was mind blowing. It was just to see somebody in that kind of role and the confidence they held, because I don't think I ever felt like I had that kind of confidence when I was that age doing it, but to kind of see them and to realize that it was a possibility and it was something that could be done, that it wasn't just kind of women who are more mature or who had kind of come to this as a second career, but there were folks who had taken this journey as young women and had brought who they were at that age and stage to the church. It was so exciting, and it was so different than the community that I had grown up in. It was kind of wonderful to see that.
Do you feel like that was kind of a piece in your own calling, Kathy, like to be able to?
A little bit, because I was looking for models, because I had started sensing a call to ministry in my teen years, which was so bizarre to me, because, as I said, kind of seeing these young women who were, as I said, who were confident and who spoke with authority. And I was so shy, I couldn't make eye contact when I talked to people. Like, and I was wondering, what is God thinking? Like, I can't do this job. Like, there's no way I could do this. I contact with people in a conversation. And so to see that process unfold and to start to get that affirmation from my community, there were people, as I said, in my beautiful little home parish that who had been a little reluctant to see me kind of take some of those early leadership roles, were some of the biggest encouragers. And who gave me opportunities to get a little bit more people skills and some social skills to be able to have a conversation and make eye contact and to start taking on some of that leadership role. I became a lay reader when I was 18 and in the parish, and to start kind of seeing that affirmation from folks who 5 years before were scandalized when I became a server was really kind of lovely and empowering, and really affirmed that affirmation from the community that this was the path that God was leading me on was really quite humbling.
Yeah.
That change.
That's amazing. And
Mhm.
I mean, Sheila, you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but it sounds like it was quite a barrier to your imagination growing up, to even like it wasn't even on the radar to consider that calling. But like, what were some of the factors that brought down those barriers for you, like allowed you to imagine that?
Um, I think a recognition that I had, in fact, kind of gotten an inkling back when I was a teen. I spent a lot of time in church as a teenager, listening to the priest, or listening to the minister, sorry, pastor, preach, and actually composing rebuttal sermons
Oh,
because I
wow.
didn't always agree with what they preached on. I thought, what is this? So in my head was already composing, if you could call it that, a rebuttal sermon, which is kind of interesting. So I'd always been really engaged, always really enjoyed Bible study, always really enjoyed church. I think that the original kind of block to me being ordained was partly because I was the opposite of Kathy. I was big and loud and, did a lot of partying in my 20s. I'm willing to admit that now, was just sort of a little bit crass and out there. And I'm thinking, oh, this is not what I picture, a priest.
Yeah.
At all, because the one female priest that I had experience with was an older woman and quite quiet and very subdued. And I'm like, yeah, that would not be me. So, then the question is, God really calling me for who I am, or am
Yeah.
I supposed to change to do this? And recognize that I wasn't, that it was me. But then it was the time, the diocese very wisely, for my, I think my second summer internship, I did it with another priest in our diocese. And so really saw her in action, saw her doing more than just leading a sermon or preaching a sermon or on Sundays, saw her, went with her when she went to the hospital, did pastoral care, sat with people, led meetings, from vestry to, just with the wardens, etc. So saw her in more of that leadership role. And I think that was when it started to kind of click in what it would mean, like in its totality, and then picturing myself in that role and thinking, could I do that? Yeah, I could. I mean, I had been in a leadership position in my secular job. This is my second career. I had worked as a store manager. So I had been in a management position, but I think I hadn't kind of equated all that with the ministry and everything. So started to see it more as a package and started to kind of notice female priests around, and then get a little more of an inkling of what it would look like for me.
Yeah, I think that's like such an important thing to identify, right? Is like God actually calls people, like not archetypes, not like, ideas, right? Like
Yeah.
it calls us as we are, and like God can use the specific things about who each of us are in order to serve, right? But it is easy to kind of get locked into just having a picture in mind and thinking, well, if I can't fit that picture, then like I can't do this. That's not how it works. Like that's not how God works. So I
Hmm.
and I think the church is so well served too by being able to have a variety of different models of leadership, right? And like I think it's cool that the three of us on this call can say, each of us is really different from the other, and like God has called all three of us, and it's really good for the church to see not just women in ministry but different kinds of women in ministry and different kinds of men in ministry and different kinds of people in ministry. Like those are all gifts to the church. Like clearly we've seen the church come a long way, and I think we've seen the church come a long way over the course of each of our lifetimes and over the course of each of the amount of years that we've been in ordained ministry. What do you think are the ongoing challenges or the biggest challenges in terms of female leadership? Like what barriers do we still encounter as female leaders in the church? That's kind of a big question.
Is there enough sugar in these treats to answer a question like that? I think the bigger challenge I have found is less about women in ministry, but some of the challenges is that we're in an increasingly secular society. And so that kind of spiritual giftedness and that spiritual authority that would have come out years ago is not respected or understood or even appreciated the same way. And so to be able to have mentors who can walk through, you talked, Sheila, you talked about the importance of that mentor that you had as part of your training in leadership. And I did too. And in fact, it was Marian Vincent was my internship supervisor when I was in second year, and that kind of to see how she did the job so differently. Nice. And so that the importance of that mentorship seems to be lost because we don't have those same opportunities. We have fewer and fewer curacies. We have fewer opportunities to kind of work with some of those experienced clerics who can help us kind of find our own path, because Marian didn't insist that I follow her path. She helped me kind of figure out who I was going to be in ministry.
Nice.
Need some of that mentoring, because as you've pointed out, we all do this so differently. And so how do we do this in a world that is turning less and less to faith and faith communities? How do we find a way to kind of share the good news that we have with people who don't necessarily don't want to hear it, but don't know they need to hear it? And so some of that is a challenge, and I think that we face in church and in community today as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting when I wear a collar, right? So I have been in hospitals. I've had people ask if I was a Catholic priest. Had to let them down and say, nope, Pope Francis isn't quite there yet. So it started making me recognize, like you say, Kathy, that there are fewer and fewer people that really understand church, the denominations. Like there was a time everybody understood what it was if you said you were Anglican or Lutheran or Mennonite, or they had at least a vague understanding of what it is. Whereas today, there's absolutely nothing. So sometimes I think that the surprise that I am a priest is less about being a woman and more that I'm just a priest at all, which is interesting, right? It is a different world. I have walked through malls and just watched the sideways glances that always come twice. That you're looking around when you're walking, right? But then it comes back again if I'm wearing my collar, which I don't do a lot when I'm shopping, but periodically it does happen, right? That people are still kind of surprised by it. I think that I haven't noticed a whole lot of pushback to being a woman in ministry. Now I've been lucky in both the parishes that I have been rectors in. I've followed long-term female priests.
Okay.
So they really were already very used to it. There have been times when I've had pushback from, wardens who weren't quite really there thinking of a woman making some of these decisions, especially when it comes down, not around liturgy, not around the building stuff. When it comes to doing a construction project, etc. Suddenly, I don't know, as women, we're not, and I'm like, I own my own home. I hire contractors on a regular basis. So yeah, that was kind of interesting and showed some of that. But for the rest, I've actually had a few people and men who said that, they're so glad that there are women in the church now, that they feel that women have some specific skill sets to offer in ministry that maybe complement or are diverse perhaps from their male counterparts, that that they think that it offers a better rounded picture of ministry when you have both men and women in it, as opposed to just one or the other. And I think that, that they're absolutely right with that.
Yeah, I mean, that has been like kind of a big conversation on the table, not just in the church for a while now, which is representation, like how important it is in terms of like generativity, in terms of continuing to raise up leaders, that when people see who's at the front of the church, they have a variety of like models for possibly seeing themselves as well, right? Like that, and not just like for leading churches, just for being Christians, right? Like that there's a variety of leaders inspiring different paths of faith. Like that's ultimately, I think, one of the gifts. I mean, I think that we can all fall pretty easily into like assuming that women are better listeners, or women are more compassionate, or women are gentler, and I don't particularly subscribe to any of those stereotypes. Lots of women who are compassionate, and I know lots of women who are like just hard-headed, like practical numbers people, like good at making the tough calls, like, and those are gifts too. I think the bottom line in terms of having female leadership is the harvest is great, but the laborers are few. Like let's open this up as widely as possible to lift up as many gifts as possible, right? Like yeah. And I think in terms of just like what I have found to be one of the biggest blessings and challenges of female leadership is I've always felt like I have to earn people's trust and gain people's respect, right? Like nobody just ascribes authority to me just because I walk in the room with a collar on. And at times I have found that like challenging when I kind of see that respect just naturally granted to somebody who looks more like what you think a priest should look like. But then at the same time, maybe there is something really beautiful and good about like having to earn people's respect and trust. That hasn't ultimately been a bad thing in ministry. And it's probably not a bad thing for the whole church either, right? Like, and maybe that's kind of back to both of your comments, and yours especially, Kathy, about being in a more secular society. There is kind of a big upside to people not having a set notion of the church or priesthood, and like just needing to do those pieces of building relationship and conversation from the ground up.
I think it's healthier for the church too.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the issues that have come up in the past, part of it has been because people ascribed leaders more respect or more trust than they should have.
Yes.
Right? Like if you think about some of that happening now, whether that leader was a priest or a teacher or a coach or whatever, but in some way they were ascribed all this trust and respect that they had not really earned and should have had to earn a little bit more, rather than assume that that was the way that it should be, and rather than other people assuming, well, you have that role, so I'm going to make these assumptions about you. In some ways, I think it's healthier when people don't, and when we have to work at it, but they have to open themselves up to it and looking at it and seeing what that looks like, and not assuming that authority or leadership looks a certain way.
Yeah. Yeah.
and acts a certain way. We have to be, there's been a sense from some people that have run into the church, men and women, that as a priest, you're supposed to be a business leader, right? That it was all about the books and the business and the fundraising. And I kind of went, yeah, no, that's not my understanding of leadership in the church. And I don't think it's a healthy one. Yes, I can do some of those things, but I don't think that is my go-to mode of leadership. And I don't think it's a good one in the church, right? So sometimes it's not entirely a bad thing.
Yeah. I think that's really well said. Do you think that there are still, like, what are the next steps that you think need to happen in terms of raising up a diversity of voices and making sure that we have different forms of leadership represented in the church? What are the big tasks still in front of us? We're certainly not a finished product yet.
I think part of it is making sure there is room for everybody at the table, that we aren't cookie cutters. And so you need to be able to do X, Y, and Z to sit around the table, that there's a diversity of gifts and that we have needed different gifts at different times, and that what people have to offer are the gifts that God has given to them. And so we need to make sure there's a place for, whether it's the people who love the details and can look after the books or whether it's the people who have relationship building skills. Like we need to make sure that we have a community where all of those gifts are not only valued, but there is a place where people can use them and we can celebrate them, that they don't all have to look the same, and that somebody who does something quietly behind the scenes is just as important to the ministry and the administration of the church or the function of the church as it is for somebody who is maybe a little bit more front and center, or who is a little bit more confident and can work a room a little bit better. That all of those gifts have a place, and that we need all of those gifts to be a healthy reflection of who God is calling us to be.
Yeah.
And I think it ties back into your comment about, the secular world. The church is changing. And so if we only say that we need people that are good preachers and that are, that is going to be the way that you lead, or, are administratively inclined, and that is the only way that a priest or a church leader can look like, we are going to run into problems, right? We need to be far more open and look beyond just the gifts that we always saw within the church, to see other ones. Someone who, is creative and sees a different way to express faith or to draw people together that may be, nothing similar to than the way we see the church today. We need to help them discover their gifts. And that may be the hard thing, because I think that people in our churches right now are very much like us. They have been raised in a church a certain way, and so they see a certain gifts belonging to church world, and may not see other gifts that they have. So exploring, what other gifts are out there that maybe the church doesn't, know it needs quite yet, that it does, right? We talk about, we have a wonderful group of ladies who make lunch for funerals, right? But the fact of the matter is they're getting a little older, and there's going to come a time when there is nobody to pick that up. And we're going to have to get lunch from, we're going to have it catered. That's the fact of the matter, because the world is changing. And so while that was a great ministry at the time, and the person who ran that was fabulous, and the person who had it down, and the women that cooked, all of it was great. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it. It just may not be sustainable, but there may be something we're not even thinking of yet, but how do we make space for that is going to be I think the interesting thing to look at in the next few years.
Yeah, I think that's so important for all of the reasons that you named, just in terms of, like, the ongoing life of the church, which guess what, isn't stagnant. Like, it's always being reborn, and it's always becoming enfleshed, right? Like, it's real people. And making room for all of those real people and their gifts and their voices and their experiences and the nice parts and the not so nice parts at the table. is so important in terms of how God works in us and how the community of faith has to function. Yeah. So we kind of touched on this at the beginning, and Sheila, you mentioned that the majority of your time at Church of the Configuration has so far been online, which is quite a challenge in and of itself. But as we wrap up this evening, I'd love to hear from each of you a high and a low from this year plus of pandemic tide. What's been an upside? What's been a downside or a particular challenge over this past challenging year?
Again, how much time do you have? Because I think there's been a lot of things that have been a challenge. I think that's almost easier to spot, the constant change of how we do things. So we went into a lockdown, and then we could kind of start doing stuff, and then we reopened our worship, and then everything got locked down. Like there's just been this constant sense of, as soon as you kind of figure out, okay, this is how we can do something, it's time for provincial legislation or provincial regulations or the diocesan regulations shift, and you have to change. So you thought you had a plan, you thought you had something figured out, and then all of a sudden it needs to shift again. And it just feels like there's a constant shifting of technology and skill sets, and trying to teach people, trying to teach yourself, trying to teach others how to use some of these new vehicles. Having to adjust expectations around how people engage and participate in them, what people's comfort level is. Like it has been a lot of change, and not kind of change that feels life-giving, but change because we're flying by the seat of our pants, and we got to figure this out because, oh, there's no church on Sunday, so in the building, so figure something out for how you're going to do it instead.
Yeah, the building the plane in the air kind of dynamic.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it's there's kind of no end in sight, because again, we're still in a lockdown, and what that reopening is going to look like as people's vaccination rates go higher, as people's comfort level, it's going to take time for people to find a comfort level in coming back out in public again. Because we have been so careful and so limiting in where we've been and how we've engaged. And so it's going to be hard to get folks back kind of in the pews, because again, we've been at home, we've been careful for so long, and to kind of get to the point where that is still being careful, we just do it differently.
Yeah.
But that's also in some ways also been an opportunity as well, because it's allowed other folks from our communities to engage gifts. It has pushed us in a big way outside of our comfort zone, and we are going to have to recreate who we are. There is no going back to what normal was. We'll be able to regain parts of that, and there'll be things that we can use as touchstones, and some of that stuff will come back. But a lot of who we were as a church before COVID is going to look very different on the other side of this.
Yeah. That word really stands out. Recreated. Like we're gonna be a new creation, ready or not.
And that's scary, and it takes time. And the problem with that is that we don't know what that's going to look like on the other side. And that's also a little bit fearful, because there have been touchstones. There are things that we want to be constant and stable. And the church has been that for a lot of people. And so the fact that we are engaging on we have to change, not because we're choosing to change or we're on some sort of a 5-point growth plan or like some of those sorts of things. We are changing because the world around us has dramatically changed overnight. And so that feels scary, because we don't know where the end of that journey is going to be or what it's going to look like. And so it feels a little bit scary along the way.
Most definitely. In some ways, I think one of the blessings is that the church did need to change. We've talked for a long time as individual priests, as clericus, as the diocese, about the need for an online presence and what that might look like and how we might go about that. And well, whether we want it or not, here we are. And talk about gifts of the church. Who knew having a guy talented in AV would be the prime gift, or a woman, that you'd be looking for in the church? And I do. I have a couple of women and a guy that run all our AV stuff. And thank you, Jesus, because if it was me, yeah, they'd be getting a printout and a phone call, because techie is not my gift for sure. So that's been interesting. And I had to admit, when I first got there, they said like they had the ability to tape. We really couldn't live stream quite so much because our internet connection wasn't that great. I was very reluctant too. I thought, oh, I'm not ready to be videotaped every week. I was afraid it would feel like a performance. It would take me out of the zone, all that kind of thing. Well, with this, we were forced into it, and it was strange at first, but certainly gotten used to it and kind of don't really think about it as much. It's just the way of the world. The great thing is we do reach more people. I would say at least 40 people almost a week watching our service than we had coming in pre-COVID. And they're coming from all over the world. I've got a friend who says they've got relatives down in somewhere in the States who watch our service on Sundays. So, I think that has been a huge blessing. I think that, to reach people where they are, because this isn't just a change the church is going through, nor is it just a change the world is going through. We are going through it together. I think it's one of the first times it feels like in some ways the church is kind of on a similar footing with the rest of the world, which it often didn't feel like. I always felt like we were kind of lagging, right? So in a way, this has been good. And so people who are sitting at home and they're bored and they're looking around and they're on their YouTube and on their computers more, are discovering church services and being able to just sit at home and watching it and see what they like. And it's maybe just kind of a gentle introduction to church, to worship anyways, a gentle introduction to worship, not necessarily fully to Christianity. And I think that's been, kind of one of the real positive things. I think the other thing for me is just seeing how the congregation just connects with each other. The friendships and the community is already so well established that, they don't need me to tell them to do it, that they are already doing it on their own and really enjoying that connection. They're like, I talked to someone on the phone that I'd never really talked to in church very much. They might not hear me, but I kind of didn't know them. And, and suddenly they called them up and they're having these conversations, which I think it's great.
Well, I find that a really inspiring note to conclude on. Kathy, as you said, like the challenges, the downsides are extremely obvious. And we could devote a part 2 and probably a part 3 to talking through the what we've all been through over this past year. But I love that sense of recreation and that sense of solidarity that you're able to identify in the midst of like circumstances that none of us would have chosen. Like we wouldn't have chosen this, and yet here we are. So God, what are you going to do with us? And God's doing a new thing with us. Yeah, pretty amazing. Well, thank you both for being with me tonight. Thank you for sharing some desserts with me. And I do feel like, a sequel might need to be in at some point, especially like we need to be together in person at some point. And
sure.
Yeah, definitely. Zoom is the same, but we'll put a pin in that for a follow-up conversation. Thank you, Sheila and Kathy, for joining me. Please join me next week for a chat with Archdeacon Michael Patterson about leadership and some other creative initiatives around life in the church. And thank you to all of you out there on the other side of the screen. Thank you for being part of how together we get to eat and talk and participate in the sweetness of life.